A hand rises, and time slows. The blow meant for the old woman stops midair, caught by her grandson. The strike never landed, but its aftershocks did. This wealthy family faced a difficult choice between their own dignity and money. In an aging Atlanta neighborhood where brick walls still hummed with the memory of old jazz tunes and Sunday sermons, lived 67-year-old Mary Williams. Every morning, Mary rose before the sun, letting the quiet hush before dawn wash over her modest home. She would stand by her window with a worn Bible in her hands, the pages marked by decades of notes and prayers, and listen. Sometimes, if the wind was right, she could hear faint music drifting from somewhere down the block, a saxophone's soulful cry from a distant radio, or perhaps just the echo of her own memories. Those melodies mingled with the first bird song and the far-off sound of church bells, creating a gentle overture to her day. This morning was warm and heavy, the summer air thick with the scent of magnolias and yesterday's rain. Mary pushed open her window and breathed deeply, closing her eyes as the damp air carried the phantom strains of a blues tune. That old song laced the air with nostalgia. As a young girl, she danced on this very street to that kind of music, barefoot and laughing, back when her late husband played trumpet at the local jazz club on Friday nights. Life had been full of music then. Now the nights were quieter, the club long shuttered, but the memories still played softly in the corners of her mind. Mary exhaled and opened her eyes. Dawn light was just creeping in, painting the peeling wallpaper of her living room a pale gold. On the mantel above the brick fireplace stood framed photographs, a gallery of family history. Her fingers traced the air in front of a picture of a smiling boy with curious eyes. James, her grandson, on his first day of school. Another frame held James in a graduation cap and gown, beaming with pride as Mary stood beside him, her arm around his shoulder. These pictures told their story, how James had come into her life and she had poured all her love and hope into raising him. James's mother, Mary's only daughter, had left when he was just a toddler, vanishing one day in search of a different life. The loss had cut Mary deep, like a shard of glass lodged just behind her ribs, but she never let the pain cripple her. Instead, she and James's father, her son-in-law, had picked up the pieces. When James's father fell into despair and then illness not long after, Mary became the boy's world. She became mother and grandmother rolled into one, steady as the church's stone foundation, warm as the sunlight that filtered through the stained glass windows each Sunday. Over the years, Mary taught James to tie his shoes, to read from the good book, and to treat others with kindness. She instilled in him the values of faith, honesty, and perseverance. It hadn't always been easy. Money was often tight, and Mary worked long hours at the church pantry and later cleaning houses to make ends meet. Yet they had love, and they had faith. Those were riches no one could steal away. Now James was a grown man of 25, on the cusp of a new chapter in his life. In just a few weeks, he was to be married. Mary's gaze drifted to the newest photo on the mantel, a candid shot of James and his fiancée Rebecca at their engagement party. James looked dashing in a crisp navy suit, and Rebecca beside him was all polished elegance with her sleek blonde hair and diamond earrings. They made a handsome couple, Mary thought. She had prayed fervently that James would find someone to share his life with, someone who would cherish his gentle heart. And when he'd introduced Rebecca to her a year ago, Mary had welcomed the young woman with open arms and an open heart. But as the engagement months passed, Mary sometimes felt a quiet unease tiptoeing at the edges of her mind. Rebecca was polite, yes, always perfectly polite, but there was a coolness under that polite smile, an invisible distance that Mary could not bridge. At first, Mary had dismissed it as nerves or the natural awkwardness of a girl meeting her fiancé's family. Yet there were small moments that lingered in Mary's memory, like discordant notes in a melody. She recalled one Sunday lunch when Rebecca had come over after church. Mary had prepared her special peach cobbler the way James loved it. Rebecca barely touched the dessert, and when Mary offered to pack some for her to take home, Rebecca's smile had thinned. "That's all right, you don't need to," she had said, voice sugary sweet but eyes flitting away. It was a simple exchange, but Mary remembered the hollowness of that smile and how Rebecca's manicured fingers tapped impatiently on the table as James finished a second helping, oblivious to the tension. Mary sighed at the memory and gently closed the window, shutting out the humid air. She told herself not to judge too quickly. Youth have their own ways, she thought. Perhaps Rebecca just wasn't used to the Williams family's humble, close-knit style. After all, Rebecca came from a different world, a wealthy family that lived in a gated house in Buckhead, with a father who was a prominent businessman and a mother who chaired charity galas. It was only natural that the girl might feel a bit out of place in Mary's cozy, cluttered living room filled with crochet doilies and gospel CDs. Mary had tried to put Rebecca at ease whenever she visited, offering tea or complimenting her on her accomplishments. Rebecca would answer politely, but she rarely asked Mary anything in return. In those moments of stiff silence, Mary felt as though she were standing on a porch with a locked door, knocking and hoping to be let in. Today would be another opportunity, Mary thought, to open that door a little wider. There was to be a family gathering in the afternoon at James's father's brother's house, Uncle Henry's place, ostensibly to discuss wedding plans and make sure everyone was on the same page. Mary had baked 2 sweet potato pies for the occasion, her way of contributing to the celebration. She wiped her hands on her apron, nerves fluttering mildly in her stomach. This gathering would bring together Rebecca's family and James's kin, 2 very different families meeting not for the first time, but for one of the final times before the big day. As Mary carefully placed the pies into carrying tins, she glanced again at the photos on the mantel. Her heart swelled with pride and protectiveness looking at James's joyful face. He deserved every bit of happiness God could grant. A soft smile touched her lips as she remembered how, as a little boy frightened of thunder, James would run to her bed at night. She would sing him an old lullaby, "His eye is on the sparrow," his favorite hymn, until his tears dried. That same tenderness still lived in him, now tempered with the strength of the man he'd become. Mary whispered a small prayer under her breath, for James's happiness, for a harmonious day with Rebecca's family, and for God to guide them all in the upcoming union. She prayed especially that any lingering misunderstandings between her and Rebecca might melt away like morning fog under the rising sun. Carrying the warm pies and her hope for peace, Mary stepped out of her front door. She did not notice how her hand trembled just slightly as she locked the door behind her. The morning was bright and clear, the cicadas already starting their chorus. Mary squared her shoulders, straightened her hat, and began the walk down the block to Uncle Henry's house, determined to greet the day with optimism. Yet, as she walked, a lone cloud drifted across the blue Georgia sky, casting a brief shadow over the cracked sidewalk in front of her. Mary paused and looked up at that cloud, feeling a sudden coolness in its shade. A whisper of intuition, of something unsettled, brushed against her heart. She clutched the pie tins a little closer to keep them steady. "It's just nerves," she assured herself. But as she continued on, the uneasy feeling lingered, quiet and persistent, like the fading echo of a distant, unresolved chord. By early afternoon, Uncle Henry's house brimmed with the lively murmur of conversation and the savory aroma of home cooking. The modest one-story home was tucked just a few streets over from Mary's, its screened porch already crowded with relatives balancing paper plates of food and plastic cups of sweet tea. Mary walked up the front steps, greeted by the squeak of the porch door and a chorus of welcomes from family. Henry, her late husband's younger brother, wrapped Mary in a quick hug, careful not to jostle the pies in her hands. His eyes crinkled kindly behind thick glasses. "You outdid yourself, Mary," Henry said, taking the pies from her. "Rebecca's folks will love a taste of real Southern pie." He offered a wink, trying to lighten the mood. Mary mustered a grateful smile as she stepped inside. The living room was filled almost to bursting. On one side, Mary recognized Rebecca's family gathered in a polite cluster. Rebecca's mother, Evelyn Sinclair, stood out in an impeccably tailored ivory suit and pearls. One manicured hand held a china teacup with the poised grace of someone more at home at a country club than a backyard barbecue. Beside her was Rebecca's father, Charles, broad-shouldered and steel-haired, quietly surveying the room with an air of practiced reserve. A few of Mary's relatives, cousins, in-laws, were chatting with them. Polite smiles all around. Mary sensed a stiffness in those interactions, as if her kin weren't quite sure how to bridge the gulf between the Sinclairs' country club polish and their own down-home warmth. Across the room, near an old upright piano, stood James and Rebecca. James's face lit up when he saw his grandmother. Excusing himself from a conversation, he crossed the room in a few strides. At 25, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a young man who had worked hard for his place in the world. He dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking every bit the handsome groom-to-be. "Nana," James exclaimed, using the childhood nickname he'd given Mary. He leaned down to kiss her cheek. "I'm so glad you're here." "I was starting to wonder if you got lost on the way," he teased. Mary chuckled softly, patting his arm. "I wouldn't miss this for anything, child. I had to make sure those pies were perfect, you know." She peered over James's shoulder at Rebecca, who approached with a measured smile. "Hello, Rebecca, dear." Rebecca's smile stayed polite and cool. She was, as always, stunning. Wearing a pale blue designer dress that probably cost more than Mary's monthly pension. "Hello, Mary," she said evenly, giving Mary a brief, perfunctory hug. Mary caught a whiff of the young woman's floral perfume. "I'm glad you could come." "James has been talking about your famous pies all morning," Rebecca added. The words sounded gracious enough, but there was a hollow ring to them, as if delivered out of obligation. "I hope they live up to the legend," Mary replied kindly. She offered Rebecca a genuine smile, hoping to thaw a bit of Rebecca's frosty cordiality. "I made plenty for everyone. Where should I set them?" Before Rebecca could answer, Evelyn glided over, still holding her teacup. She gave Mary a gracious, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mary, isn't it? We met at the engagement party. I'm Evelyn, Rebecca's mom. Yes, of course." "Good to see you again," Mary said, balancing the pies. Evelyn relieved her of one tin, and James quickly took the other. "I've heard so much about your cooking," Evelyn went on lightly. "Rebecca says your family has quite the tradition with recipes." "How lovely," she said, lovely, in a tone that straddled the line between sincere and condescending. Mary simply nodded and followed as Evelyn and James carried the pies to the dining room table, already crowded with a potluck spread of dishes from Mary's side of the family. As people gathered around the dining area, Uncle Henry cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. "All right, y'all, let's get this meeting started before we eat all the food," he joked, earning a ripple of laughter. "First off, thanks for coming together. It's not often we have both families under one roof. We just want to make sure the wedding planning's going smooth, since we're a few weeks out. So, let's talk details." A general murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Mary took a seat at the edge of the couch with Aunt Clarice beside her. Across from them, Evelyn and Charles sat with Rebecca between them on the love seat. James remained standing by Mary's side, one hand resting protectively on the back of the couch near her shoulder. Mary felt comforted by that small gesture of support. The discussion began innocuously enough. Talk of the venue and guest list, the schedule for the day. The Sinclairs had already booked the grand ballroom at their country club for the reception, and it turned out they'd decided to hold the ceremony there as well. "It's just more convenient to have everything in one place," Rebecca explained with a polite smile when this was mentioned. Mary's heart sank at learning that the wedding would no longer be in her cherished Greater Hope Baptist Church. She had dearly hoped to watch James exchange vows in the little sanctuary where he'd been baptized and grown up, singing in the choir. She swallowed her disappointment, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "This day isn't about me," she reminded herself. "It's about James and Rebecca." Mary mustered the courage to ask softly, "Will Pastor Evans still be officiating?" Pastor Evans was their family's minister, practically a member of the family himself. James nodded quickly. "Absolutely. We want Pastor Evans. Right, Rebecca?" He looked at his fiancée, and Mary could sense a gentle insistence in his usually easygoing voice. Rebecca's smile thinned for just a heartbeat. "Of course," she said, a slight edge to her tone that only Mary seemed to notice. "Pastor Evans is welcome to marry us at the club." The conversation moved on to other details: the catering menu, floral arrangements, the rehearsal dinner. Mary mostly listened as Rebecca and Evelyn laid out their grand plans: an 8-piece band, elaborate centerpieces, a designer cake. James chimed in here and there, but Mary could tell he was deferring to the Sinclairs on many points. She offered an occasional comment when asked, suggesting a couple of simpler touches, but each time her ideas were politely brushed aside. When Mary mentioned including a beloved family recipe on the menu, Evelyn smiled and said they'd already hired a caterer. When Mary wondered aloud if some ladies from her church could help with the decorations, Rebecca replied, "Oh, that's not necessary," before quickly changing the topic. Each such exchange was small, but together they stung. Mary caught Clarice giving her a sympathetic squeeze of the hand, sensing her discomfort. Mary kept her smile pinned in place and reminded herself that compromise was part of blending families. If fancy bouquets instead of her garden wildflowers would keep the peace, so be it. After nearly an hour, Mary felt a dull headache forming at her temples. She had never felt so out of place among her own kin. The Sinclairs were cordial, but she felt the subtle undercurrent. This wedding was their show, and the Williams family was expected to follow along. Mary began to feel like an unwelcome guest at what should have been a shared celebration. She was thinking of excusing herself to get some fresh air when Evelyn suddenly addressed her in that overly sweet tone. "Mary, dear," she cooed, "have you decided what you'll wear to the wedding? We'd love for it to match our color scheme for the photos." Mary blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Oh, I was planning to wear my best Sunday suit." "It's a pale blue," she replied politely. Evelyn's smile tightened. "Pale blue, I see. Our theme is ivory and gold. Perhaps you have something in a neutral tone instead. We want everything to look cohesive. If not, I'd be happy to take you shopping." A flush crept up Mary's neck. She felt James straighten up beside her, sensing her embarrassment. "Mrs. Sinclair," he began, a hint of warning in his voice. Mary quickly reached over and patted James's hand, stopping him. The last thing she wanted was to make a scene. Forcing a gracious smile, she answered Evelyn, "Thank you, but my suit is quite subtle." "It won't stand out, I promise. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble." "As you wish," Evelyn said, lifting her teacup as if to punctuate the polite dismissal. "It was only a suggestion. We just want the day to be perfect, after all." An uncomfortable silence settled for a moment. Rebecca, who had been quiet through the exchange, suddenly cleared her throat. "Mama James, why don't we help bring out the food now?" she said, already rising from her seat. "I think we could all use a little break before we eat." Without waiting for an answer, Rebecca clicked away toward the kitchen on her high heels. Evelyn gave a thin smile and stood to follow. James squeezed Mary's shoulder gently, an unspoken apology in his eyes, before he trailed after Rebecca. Mary released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The question about her outfit had felt like yet another rebuke, a reminder that she didn't quite fit into the picture being painted. But it was over now, Mary told herself, trying to soothe the sting. Just a few more hours of togetherness, then she could go home and pray on it all. She managed to return a polite smile as murmurs of casual conversation started up around the room now that the meeting portion was done. Perhaps a break was indeed what everyone needed. Glad for the excuse to move, Mary stood, smoothing her skirt. She made her way through the throng towards the kitchen to fetch her pies and set them out for dessert. The house was crowded and noisy, laughter mixing with the gospel record Uncle Henry had put on in the background for ambiance. A vintage tune Mary recognized, something her husband used to hum. The familiarity of the melody eased her nerves slightly, like a musical hand on her shoulder. She stepped into the relative quiet of the kitchen. Sunlight slanted through the window over the sink, catching motes of dust in the air. On the counter, her pies sat among other desserts, awaiting their turn. Mary picked up a knife to cut them into slices for easier serving later, focusing on the task to steady her thoughts. She reminded herself again to be gracious and patient. For James's sake, she could endure a bit of disrespect. The important thing was his happiness. From the doorway behind her, voices drifted in from the living room, faintly at first, then clearer as a couple of figures entered the adjacent hallway. Mary recognized them immediately. It was Rebecca and her mother, speaking in low tones just around the corner. She assumed they were on their way to rejoin everyone, but their conversation made them pause out of sight, evidently unaware that Mary was mere feet away in the kitchen. Can't keep coddling her feelings, Mother, Rebecca was saying, her voice taut with irritation. This is my wedding. If James's grandmother keeps pushing and pushing... Keep your voice down, Evelyn cautioned in a sharp whisper. I know it's frustrating, but appearances, darling. We must keep things polite. There was a pause, and Mary, knife in hand, stood rooted to the spot by the counter. Her heart kicked in her chest. They were talking about her. That much was obvious. A part of her knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but she couldn't help it. Their words held her like a rabbit caught in brambles. I have been polite, Rebecca hissed, her tone dripping with the effort of self-restraint. But she's always there, always trying to involve herself. The church, the menu, even what she's going to wear. Why should I have to worry about her outfit matching? This is ridiculous, Evelyn responded, her voice calmer but equally cold. My dear, think of the advantages. James adores her, yes, but once you're married, well, we'll be your family. He'll understand that we come first. Mary means well, but she needs to learn her place in these things. Mary felt as if she'd been slapped, even as she remained hidden. Her hands trembled around the knife handle. Learn her place. The words rang in her ears with a cruel resonance. Was that truly how they saw her? As an interloper in her own grandson's wedding? She swallowed, trying to steady the sudden dryness in her throat. Rebecca made a scoffing sound. If she doesn't back off, I swear I will not let her ruin this for me. Or for us, she amended, though the correction sounded like an afterthought. I don't care what James says. If that old woman doesn't stay out of the way, there won't be a wedding. I'll make sure of it. The hallway fell silent except for Mary's pulse thudding in her ears. She felt the color drain from her face. It was not just the words, but the seething malice in Rebecca's voice that struck her to the core. Mary's first instinct was disbelief. Surely she must have misheard or misinterpreted. But no, the meaning was plain. Rebecca saw her as a threat, as someone to be cast aside if she became too involved. And Evelyn's silence now seemed to signify agreement. A tear escaped Mary's eye, hot with shame and sorrow. In all her imaginings of James's wedding, never had she considered she might be unwelcome at it. She pressed a hand over her mouth, fearing even her breathing might give her away. Her chest constricted as though that shard of glass from years ago had suddenly lodged itself again behind her ribs, twisting painfully. In the next room, someone called Rebecca's name, James, from the sound of it wondering where she'd gone. The voices in the hall abruptly ceased. Mary heard the hurried click of heels on wood as Rebecca and Evelyn moved off, returning to the living room with airy excuses about checking on something. Mary remained frozen in the kitchen, pie knife in hand and pie uncut as if carved in stone herself. Her mind raced. What do I do? She thought frantically. Confront Rebecca? Walk away quietly and say nothing? If she spoke up, it would surely cause a scene and possibly drive a deeper wedge between James and the woman he loved. But if she stayed silent, could she face watching her grandson marry someone who held such contempt for her? Mary's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fully fall. She inhaled shakily, placing the knife down. The gospel song from the record player wafted softly into the kitchen, a sweet, melancholic tune about standing by faith. It was as if the music itself urged her to be strong, to hold on to dignity. Mary straightened, wiped her eyes quickly with the corner of her apron, and took a long breath. She couldn't make a decision standing here hiding. First, she had to calm herself and rejoin the family, at least for now. Mary gently covered her pies with foil again, hands trembling. She would figure out the rest moment by moment. With one more deep breath, Mary stepped out of the kitchen, her face composed in a practiced mask of grace even as her heart thundered with hurt. None of the others in the crowded living room could have guessed at the storm gathering behind Mary's gentle eyes as she quietly rejoined the party. Her decision was made, though her hand still shook ever so slightly. For James's sake and her own, the truth would have to come out soon. Dinner had always been a sacred time for Mary's family, a time when gratitude was shared along with the food. But tonight, at Uncle Henry's house, the atmosphere around the dining table was strained and unnatural. People ate in a clamor of clinking forks and plates, but the easy laughter from earlier had faded into pockets of awkward silence. Mary sat near one end of the table, picking at her food without appetite. The sweet potato pie on her plate, usually her favorite, might as well have been ash for all she could taste. Across from her, Rebecca and her parents maintained an air of polite normalcy, but Mary could see the tension in the tight set of Rebecca's shoulders and the forced smile on Evelyn's face as she made small talk with a cousin. James was seated beside Rebecca, but his eyes kept drifting to Mary, concern etched on his face. Throughout the meal, Mary tried to act as if everything were fine. She bowed her head during grace, passed dishes when asked, and even managed to compliment the green bean casserole that one of Rebecca's relatives had brought. Outwardly, she was the picture of composure. Inwardly, her thoughts were a storm. The hurtful words she'd overheard looped in her mind, each repetition chipping away at her composure. She could hardly bear to look at Rebecca now, knowing the contempt that lurked behind the young woman's cordial facade. Worse, Mary's heart ached at the thought of James sitting so lovingly beside someone who had so little respect for him and his kin. James cleared his throat and gently pushed his chair back, unable to pretend any longer. "Nana," he said softly, leaning forward so only Mary and a few nearby relatives could hear. "Are you feeling all right? You've hardly touched your dinner." All eyes nearby turned to Mary. She opened her mouth, aiming to reply with a reassuring yes, but found she couldn't quite form the lie. Her gaze flickered to James's earnest face and then down to her plate. "I'm just a bit tired, darling," she said quietly, offering a faint smile. "It's been a long day, that's all." James didn't look convinced. He knew her too well. His hand found Mary's under the table and gave it a squeeze. "We can head out if you want. I'll take you home," he offered, concern lacing his voice. "The planning can continue without us for tonight." At that, Rebecca, who had been half listening while nibbling at her meal, snapped her head up. A delicate frown creased her brow. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone measured but with an undercurrent of impatience. "We were just about to discuss the schedule for the wedding weekend." Mary withdrew her hand from James's and folded both in her lap. "Everything's fine, dear," she said to Rebecca with a polite nod. "I don't want to disrupt the evening. Please, continue with your discussion. I can catch up on any decisions later." Evelyn dabbed her mouth with a napkin and interjected, "Nonsense, Mary. If you're not feeling well, by all means, take care of yourself. We wouldn't want you falling ill before the big day." Her words were sympathetic, but Mary did not miss the glint in Evelyn's eye. The older woman sounded almost hopeful that Mary might excuse herself. Mary's cheeks warmed with embarrassment. She felt the scrutiny of half the table now. Uncle Henry paused, mid-chew, looking between the women with concern. Clarice pursed her lips in worry. Across from Mary, Rebecca exchanged a quick, unreadable look with her mother. "I'll be all right," Mary murmured. She hated being the focus of attention like this. All she wanted was a graceful exit, to leave before her emotions betrayed her. She reached for her water glass to occupy her trembling hands. "Maybe some fresh air would do me good." "Excuse me a moment." She pushed her chair back gently and stood. At once James was rising too. "I'll come with you." "No, James, stay," Mary insisted softly, putting a hand on his shoulder to keep him seated. She mustered a reassuring smile for him. "I'm just stepping out on the porch for a minute. I'll be fine." James hesitated, then nodded reluctantly and sank back into his chair. Mary could feel his eyes on her as she made her way around the table. She kept her chin up and her pace steady, willing her knees not to betray the shakiness she felt. The murmured conversations around her resumed, only to falter again as Mary passed by Rebecca's seat. Rebecca was twirling her fork idly, not eating. As Mary came abreast of her, Rebecca glanced up. For an instant, Mary saw something raw and unsettled in the young woman's blue eyes. A flash of uncertainty or guilt, perhaps, but it was quickly masked. Rebecca gave a thin, perfunctory smile. "Do you need any help, Mary?" she asked in a tone that suggested the opposite of helpfulness. "No, thank you," Mary replied with gentle firmness. "Just getting some air." Rebecca's eyes followed Mary with a cool, inscrutable expression as she stepped away from the table. Mary moved toward the front door, the conversations rising and falling behind her like a muffled tide. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached the screened door and pushed it open. The evening air was thick and warm as a blanket, but to Mary it was a relief to escape the charged atmosphere inside. She let the door slap lightly shut behind her and took a few steps out onto the porch. The sun had set fully now, leaving the sky a deep indigo. In the distance, crickets harmonized with the low rumble of city traffic beyond the neighborhood. Mary closed her eyes and inhaled, trying to steady herself. She wrapped her arms around her body. Through the window behind her, the muted drone of family chatter continued. They were probably moving on with the wedding talk. Perhaps they thought her just an old woman whose nerves got the better of her. For a moment, Mary considered simply walking the few blocks back to her own home without another word. She could slip away, spare herself further indignity. But if she left now, what then? Pretend all was well until the wedding and watch James tie himself to someone who held him and his grandmother in contempt. The very idea made her feel ill. As Mary wrestled with her thoughts, the porch door creaked open. James stepped out, worry shadowing his face. "Nana," he said softly, closing the door behind him, "I had to check on you." "Talk to me, please," Mary turned to her grandson. In the pale glow of the porch light, James's face looked younger than his years, concerned and a little helpless. Her resolve wavered. She had wanted to keep the burden of what she'd learned off his shoulders, at least for tonight. But perhaps he deserved to know now. Mary opened her mouth to speak, but before any words came, another voice sliced through the quiet. "James," Rebecca called from the doorway, her tone tight. She stepped onto the porch as well, folding her arms. Evelyn hovered just behind her in the entry, peering out with a frown. "What's going on? We're in the middle of planning and you've both disappeared." James ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn between the two women he cared about. "Becca, I just needed a minute to check on Nana." "She's not feeling well," Rebecca's gaze flicked to Mary, and the softness James knew was nowhere in her eyes now. In the dim porch light, her expression looked almost cold. "If she's not well, I'm sure Uncle Henry or someone can drive her home," Rebecca said coolly. "We need you inside, James. The timing for the rehearsal and everything, it's all things you have to be present for." Mary felt the insinuation like a bruise. She was being implicitly dismissed. She drew a breath and spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "Rebecca, sweetheart, I appreciate your concern, but I'd like a word with my grandson, if you don't mind." Family to family. Something in Rebecca's facade flickered, irritation, disdain. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and managed a brittle smile. "Mrs. Williams, I think we've already had plenty of family time today. The planning is at a critical point, and James can rejoin you in a moment," Mary interjected gently but firmly. It was the first time she had ever interrupted Rebecca, and it took the younger woman by surprise. Evelyn made a small noise in the doorway, perhaps a protest, but Mary pressed on, addressing Rebecca with as much politeness as she could muster. "I won't keep him long. I just have something to say to my grandson while we have a bit of privacy." A tense beat passed. Rebecca's smile vanished. The mask of courtesy slid from her face, revealing bare frustration. "Fine," she said after a moment, voice clipped. She turned on her heel and stalked back inside past her mother. Evelyn cast Mary and James a disapproving glance, but followed her daughter in without a word, letting the screen door bang shut. In the relative stillness that followed, James looked at Mary in bewilderment. "Nana," he began, "what is going on?" Mary motioned for him to sit with her on the porch bench. Her hands were shaking, so she clasped them tightly together in her lap. "James," she said slowly, fighting to keep her voice from quavering, "there's something you need to know." "Something I heard tonight." James's brow furrowed. He had never seen his grandmother look so troubled. "Something you heard?" Mary nodded. Her eyes searched his face tenderly. "I didn't mean to overhear, but I did. I heard Rebecca and her mama talking. About me, about you." She swallowed hard. "I'm afraid, grandson, that not everyone's intentions here are as loving as they seem." A flash of alarm crossed James's features. He opened his mouth to question her further, but just then the porch door swung open once more, this time with force. Rebecca had returned, unable to restrain herself any longer. She stepped out, eyes blazing, and behind her loomed Evelyn and a couple of other curious family members peering over shoulders. Clearly, the tension had drawn an audience. "Do you care to share with the class what's being discussed out here?" Rebecca demanded. Gone was any pretense of sweetness. Her voice was loud enough that those inside could hear too, and conversations in the house were quickly hushed. "Or do we have to guess?" James stood up, stepping protectively closer to Mary. "Rebecca, please, we're just—" "No, I want to know what lies she's been feeding you," Rebecca snapped, chin raised as she fixed Mary with an accusatory glare. Gasps flickered from a few people now watching from the doorway and windows. Mary rose from the bench slowly, heart pounding. In the corner of her eye, she saw Uncle Henry and Clarisse near the doorway, alarmed and unsure whether to intervene. Evelyn placed a restraining hand on Rebecca's arm, whispering something, but Rebecca shook it off. "Rebecca," Mary said in a calm, firm voice, though her insides were trembling, "no one is telling lies." "I was just explaining to James." "Explaining what?" Rebecca cut her off harshly. "What a burden his fiancée is. How awful I am as a person." She stepped closer, and James instinctively moved between her and Mary, as if to shield his grandmother from the venom in Rebecca's voice. "Stop it," James said, his tone half pleading, half commanding. "Rebecca, that's enough. You're blowing this out of proportion." Rebecca let out a sharp laugh that held no humor. Her cheeks were flushed with anger. "Am I? Because from where I stand, James, she's the one causing a scene. We are trying to plan our wedding, and she's dragging you out here and filling your head with nonsense because she can't stand not being the center of attention for one evening." Mary felt those words like a physical blow. She drew a sharp breath, steadying herself on the porch railing. "I beg your pardon," she said softly. "Rebecca, you're mistaken," James interjected, arms out as if to hold both factions at bay. "Nana hasn't done anything of the sort." "She's been against me from day one," Rebecca barreled on, her voice rising. Emotions that had been kept on a tight leash all day were now unleashed. A few more family members drifted onto the porch or just outside it, forming a worried semicircle. Among them, Mary recognized one of her cousins, who was wringing her hands, and a couple of Rebecca's younger relatives with wide, scandalized eyes. Always criticizing, always interfering. "You all saw it," Rebecca appealed to the onlookers desperately. "She questioned every decision, tried to push her ideas. She even made a fuss about the ceremony location and her outfit. It's like she can't stand that this isn't all about her." "That's not true," Mary protested, her voice trembling despite her attempt to keep calm. "I only ever wanted to help." "Help?" Rebecca's tone dripped with sarcasm. "By barging into every discussion, insisting on your way?" "You've done nothing but make things harder," a few of the onlookers murmured uncertainly. Mary saw Evelyn watching with arms crossed and a satisfied glint in her eye, content to let her daughter say what perhaps she'd wanted to say herself. On the other hand, Clarisse had her hand over her mouth in dismay, and Henry looked pained and confused. James shook his head fiercely. "That's enough, Rebecca," he said, anger sharpening his voice now. "I don't know what's gotten into you." "What's gotten into me?" Rebecca shot back incredulously. "James, open your eyes. She's manipulating you. She's been from the start. You think I didn't notice how every time we tried to make a decision, your grandmother had to put in her word, tugging on your heartstrings with her memories and traditions?" Rebecca practically spat the words. "Well, I'm done playing nice." Mary's lips parted in shock. A rush of indignation coursed through her, mingling with deep sorrow. "I have never," she began, but Rebecca rounded on her fully now. "You have never accepted that James has a life beyond you," Rebecca seethed, stepping closer. James caught her arm lightly, trying to calm her, but she jerked free. "You raised him. We all know. You never let anyone forget it." Poor James, abandoned by his mother, only had good old Nana to save the day. Rebecca's voice was mocking, and Mary blanched as if slapped. Yes, you devoted your life to him, and that's admirable. But he's a grown man now, and you can't stand that. He's choosing to build a family with me. You can't stand not being in control. Tears stung Mary's eyes at the sheer unfairness of the accusation. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words tangled amid the hurt welling in her throat. James looked horrified. Rebecca, stop this right now. You're talking about the woman who raised me? I'm telling the truth, James, Rebecca cried, turning to him, her face contorted with desperate fury. It's her or me. I won't have her sabotaging our marriage. If she can't step aside and stop meddling, then there won't be a wedding. I'll cancel everything. She pointed a shaking finger toward Mary as gasps and murmurs rippled through the small crowd. I refuse to marry into a family where I'm disrespected at every turn by her. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the night insects churring in the yard. Mary felt her heart thudding dully, the edges of her vision blur with tears she was holding back by sheer will. She could not remember ever being spoken to like this, certainly not by someone she had tried to welcome and love. Each accusation from Rebecca had cut into her, and now the ultimatum hung in the air like a guillotine. Mary must remove herself, or Rebecca would walk away with James's future. James stood as if rooted to the spot. He stared at Rebecca, then at his grandmother, his dear Nana, who now stood trembling ever so slightly, one hand at her breast as if to dull an internal pain. He saw the anguish in Mary's gentle face, bravely held in check, and he saw something else too. As Rebecca glared, defiant and unyielding, James saw a side of her he had never fully glimpsed until tonight, hard, unforgiving, and fueled by pride. When he finally spoke, James's voice was quiet, but it carried in the hush. Becky, do you hear what you're saying? He asked, a tremor in his tone. You're asking me to choose between you and the woman who is my family, my blood, who sacrificed everything to raise me. Do you really think I could ever turn my back on her? Rebecca's eyes flashed. If she's truly family, she should act like it and stay out of our business, she retorted. All I'm asking is for healthy boundaries. But she can't do that, can she? So yes, if you want me, if you want a life with me, you can't have her constantly in our marriage. You need to make a choice. A few relatives exchanged anxious looks. One of Mary's cousins, a timid woman named Darlene, spoke up from the doorway, her voice wavering. Mary, maybe it's best if you just give them some space, for the sake of the marriage. We all want James to be happy. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing the sorrow threatening to overtake her. Even her own kin were entertaining this demand. She understood the pressure. They all knew the Sinclairs were influential, and many likely imagined the benefits of James's union with Rebecca's family. But to suggest she remove herself from her grandson's life to buy that happiness? James's expression hardened at Darlene's words. He squared his shoulders, stepping closer to Mary as if physically affirming his side. Stop, he said, not loudly, but with a resolve that silenced Darlene and anyone else who might have joined her. James's eyes never left Rebecca's. I have heard enough. Rebecca opened her mouth, but James held up a hand. The simple gesture, so rarely used by the gentle young man, froze her in place. If you think for 1 second, James said, his voice gaining strength, that I would cast aside the woman who raised me, who has been mother, father, and guardian angel all in one, just to appease you, then you don't know me at all. He reached back and took Mary's hand, grasping it firmly. Mary felt the warmth and steadiness of his grip, and a surge of love welled in her, mingled with fear for what this moment might cost him. Rebecca's face went white, then red. James, she said in a strangled voice, what are you— No. You've said your piece. Now I'll say mine. James interrupted, a newfound steel in his voice. He stepped forward, gently moving Mary slightly behind him. I love you, Rebecca. I thought we were going to build a life together. But that life will never come at the expense of my grandmother. He drew a breath, and in the silence, Mary could hear her own heart pounding. If you truly cared about me, you would never have asked me to choose, because you'd know that there is no choice. Mary Williams is my family. She's not some optional part of my life I can drop for you or anyone. Rebecca stared at him, chest heaving. You're choosing her over me? She whispered, voice cracking in disbelief. Tears glimmered in James's eyes, but he held Rebecca's gaze. If you force me to choose, then yes. I choose my grandmother. I choose the woman who has always chosen me. He squeezed Mary's hand, his own shaking now. If you truly loved me, you wouldn't make me tear my heart in two just to satisfy your pride. A stunned hush fell over the porch. Evelyn stepped forward, looking furious. James, think about what you're saying, she urged. Our families, this wedding. There's a lot at stake here. Emotions are high, and I'm sure we can work this out privately. James shook his head. Mrs. Sinclair, with all due respect, no one who loved me would have treated my grandmother the way you two did tonight. I won't pretend otherwise or hide this away behind closed doors. Not anymore. Mary felt a sob threaten to escape her throat at his words, but she held it back, standing tall beside her grandson. She wanted to tell him he didn't have to do this for her, that she would step aside if it meant his happiness. But the fierce protectiveness in James's stance and the heartbreak in his voice kept her silent. This was his choice to make, and he had made it. Rebecca looked as though she'd been slapped. She swayed on her heels, eyes wet, perhaps more from fury than sorrow. So that's it, she breathed. You'd throw me away after everything because of her? James's jaw clenched. If everything we have means so little respect for who I am and where I come from, then it was never going to work anyway, he said softly. Rebecca's composure shattered. You ungrateful! She burst out, and before anyone could stop her, she lunged forward, arm raised. In her unhinged anger, she aimed to strike James. A slap, a shove, even she might not have known. But Mary, who had stepped out from behind James in alarm, was directly in the line of that sudden fury. Time seemed to slow in the instant that followed. Mary saw Rebecca's eyes wild and wet, saw the hand flying toward her own face. She braced, a gasp rising to her lips. But the blow never landed. James had moved faster, intercepting Rebecca's wrist in midair. He gripped it firmly, stopping her hand inches from Mary. A collective gasp rose from the witnesses around them. Rebecca struggled for a moment, then stopped, realizing what she'd almost done. Her chest heaved as she stared, first at her captured wrist, then at James. James released her arm with a look of profound disappointment and sorrow etched on his face. My God, Rebecca, he said hoarsely, what have we come to? The porch was silent except for Rebecca's ragged breathing and Mary's pounding heart. Mary stood stock still, one hand over her mouth in shock. She felt Clarice's arm come around her shoulders from one side and Uncle Henry's steadying hand on the other. Both had moved in protectively as the situation exploded, and now they helped ease Mary back a step or two, away from Rebecca's reach. Mary was grateful for their support. Her legs felt weak. Rebecca's eyes darted around at the faces watching her, some shocked, some judgmental, some frightened. Realizing her loss of control had been laid bare, she took a step back toward the door, shaking with a mix of anger and humiliation. Evelyn quickly moved to her side, putting an arm around her daughter and glaring at James and Mary as though they were the villains in this scene. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. The night pressed in around them, the chirp of crickets the only sound as everyone held their breath. Mary could not hold back her tears any longer. They slipped down her cheeks silently. She had never wanted any of this. To be the wedge splitting her beloved grandson from his bride, to be the cause of such bitterness and pain, yet here they were, and the true character of this union had been laid tragically bare. It was Uncle Henry who finally broke the silence, clearing his throat gruffly. I think that's enough for tonight, he said, voice unsteady. He looked between James and Rebecca with a sorrowful shake of his head. We all need to cool off and pray on this, I reckon. Some of the relatives nodded in agreement. Darlene stepped back inside, already whispering to another cousin, their faces pale with shock. The spell was broken. People began to disperse, some retreating into the house, others murmuring excuses as they slipped out into the yard to head home. Evelyn guided Rebecca, who had gone quiet and glassy-eyed, towards the door. But before crossing the threshold, Rebecca paused and looked back over her shoulder at James and Mary. The hatred in her glare was apparent even in the dim light. "This isn't over," she spat, voice trembling. "James, you're making the biggest mistake of your life." Then her gaze shifted to Mary, and there was a venom in it that made Clarice's arm tighten around Mary protectively. "And you'll regret this." Evelyn hushed her daughter, but not before casting a final withering look at Mary, a look that seemed to say, "Look what you've done." Then the two disappeared into the house, leaving an echoing silence on the porch. James exhaled a breath he'd been holding for what felt like an eternity. He turned to Mary, eyes shining with tears in the faint light. "Nana, I am so sorry," he choked out. He gently cupped her elbow as if to anchor her. "I never wanted—" Mary found her voice at last, though it wavered. "Hush, child," she whispered, pulling James into a tight embrace. She held him fiercely, one hand cradling the back of his head as if he were still that little boy who'd run to her when he skinned his knee. James's arms went around her, and she felt them trembling. Over his shoulder, Mary saw the remaining family members on the porch turn away, giving them a semblance of privacy in this raw moment. She stroked James's back, her tears dampening the shoulder of his shirt. "You have nothing to apologize for," Mary murmured into his ear. "Nothing. You did right by yourself, and by me." Inside the house, the sounds of commotion were dying down. Mary guessed that Evelyn was whisking Rebecca away, perhaps to avoid further embarrassment. Good, she thought wearily. Let them go. Let there be peace, if only for a night. As James held on to her like he might never let go, Mary felt both devastation and a profound pride. The night's events were a nightmare she wouldn't have wished on anyone. But James's loyalty, his courage, and standing up for her was a bright, shining truth amidst the darkness. She kissed his cheek softly and whispered, "We'll be all right, James. God is with us. We'll be all right." Behind them, Uncle Henry cleared his throat gently. "Mary? James? Why don't you come inside for a bit? Have a seat. Get some water." His voice was kind, heavy with concern. Mary drew back from James enough to look into his face. She wiped at his tears with her thumbs the way she used to when he was a child. He managed a broken smile at her, eyes red. Together, leaning on each other, they turned and went back into the house, leaving the warm Georgia night and its chorus of crickets behind them. The porch door creaked shut, the final note in the discordant symphony that this family gathering had become. Later that night, Mary sat in her small living room with James beside her on the sofa. The house was quiet now, far removed from the turmoil at Uncle Henry's. A single lamp cast a gentle glow over the worn floral patterns of Mary's furniture. On the coffee table lay 2 untouched cups of tea that Mary had made out of habit when they got home, now gone cold. James had his head in his hands, elbows propped on his knees. He had barely spoken since they left Henry's house. Mary's arm was around his back, rubbing slow circles between his tense shoulders. She could feel the quivering in his body, like a wound-up spring finally releasing. At last, James broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nana, did that really just happen?" He lifted his face, and Mary's heart squeezed at the anguish in his eyes. "I keep thinking, maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe I shouldn't have lost my temper." Mary sighed softly and drew him closer. For a fleeting moment, he was a little boy again in her embrace, seeking comfort after a bad dream. "We both wish tonight had gone differently," she said, her voice gentle in the stillness of the room. "But you did what you thought was right. You defended your family, your principles. There's no shame in that." James's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "I never wanted to hurt her," he murmured. "I loved her, Nana, or at least I thought I did. How could she say those things? How could she—" His voice choked off. Mary handed him a tissue, and he pressed it to his eyes. Outside, a warm rain began pattering against the window, soft and steady. Mary looked toward the sound. "Sometimes love makes people do foolish things, James. It can bring out our best and our worst She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Rebecca. She let pride and fear get the better of her. Maybe she felt I threatened her place in your life. It doesn't excuse what she did or said, but perhaps in her own hurtful way she believed she was fighting for you. James drew a ragged breath. It didn't feel like she was fighting for me. It felt like she was fighting to possess me, like I'm some prize that comes with conditions. He shook his head. The Rebecca I saw tonight, I didn't recognize that person. Mary held his hand between both of hers. We often see true faces when trials come, child. And tonight we all had a trial. She paused, her own hurt flaring briefly as images of Rebecca's enraged face and cutting words flashed in her mind. She closed her eyes, centering herself. James, I don't want to speak ill of her. My heart is praying that all of us find some healing after this, but whatever happens, I need you to know you did not disappoint me. You stood up for what's right, for respecting your family and yourself. Your parents, if they were here, would be proud of the man you are. A single tear escaped down James's cheek, and Mary gently brushed it away. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. The tension in James's posture slowly unwound, replaced by exhaustion. Finally, James straightened a little and looked around the familiar living room. His eyes landed on the framed photographs lining the mantel, snapshots of birthdays, graduations, little moments of their life together. A tremor passed over his face. Nana. Maybe everyone would be better off if I just called off the wedding, he said quietly. I can't imagine going through with it after what happened. Not with things like this, Mary's hand tightened on his. She had dreaded this outcome for months, the wedding falling apart, her grandson's heart broken. Now it was here, and she searched for the right response. James, you must follow what your heart and your conscience tell you, she said softly. If you believe calling it off is best, then that's what you should do. I'll stand by you, whatever comes. You know that James nodded, but fresh tears brimmed in his eyes. I loved her, he whispered, voice cracking. I thought we were going to have a future. I imagined having children with her, Nana, you being a great-grandmother, holidays together. All of it. He dragged a hand through his hair, anguish in every movement. How did it turn so wrong? Oh, my sweet boy. Mary pulled him into another hug, rocking him slightly as the rain drummed its lullaby on the roof. I'm so sorry. I truly am. She felt her own tears slipping out. Not for the insults she endured, but for the pain in James's voice. I know you had dreams. Sometimes when people love each other, they still can hurt each other terribly. And sometimes love isn't enough when respect isn't there too. James closed his eyes and leaned against her. He hadn't slept properly in days, Mary realized. None of them had. In the rush of wedding planning and now this turmoil. His body was giving in to exhaustion and sorrow. Mary stroked his hair, humming, his eyes on the sparrow under her breath, the same hymn that had played earlier and comforted her in the kitchen. She felt James relax a bit more with each familiar bar of the melody. Before long, James's breathing evened out. He had drifted into a fitful doze against her shoulder, finally finding a moment's respite. Mary kept humming softly, even as tears rolled down her face. She gazed up at the ceiling and whispered a prayer into the dimly lit room. Lord, guide us. Give us strength to face whatever dawn brings. She sat like that for a long time, holding her sleeping grandson as the rain sang its gentle song outside. The next morning came with gray skies and a humid heaviness in the air that matched the mood in Mary's household. James had left early, needing some time alone to think and sort out the practical matters. He mentioned something about speaking to his boss and taking a few days off work. Mary suspected he also wanted to avoid the inevitable barrage of phone calls that would come through once news of the previous night spread through the family grapevine. Sure enough, by mid-morning, the telephone began to ring. Concerned relatives who had witnessed the scene or heard of it Called to check on Mary, to gossip, or to offer unsolicited advice? Mary answered a few calls. She reassured Aunt Clarice that she was holding up fine. She listened patiently as Cousin Darlene fretfully suggested that perhaps Mary might apologize to smooth things over. After all, Mary, you know how these youngsters are. Sometimes we elders have to bend, Darlene had said, to which Mary only responded with a noncommittal hum. By noon, Mary was weary of the phone. She left it unanswered and retreated to her kitchen, finding solace in chores. The familiar motions of peeling potatoes for a simple stew gave her something concrete to focus on. But even as her hands worked, her mind churned. She replayed the confrontation 100 times, thinking of words she might have said differently or not at all. Mostly she worried about James, worried that in protecting her, he had sacrificed his own happiness. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Mary wiped her hands on a dishcloth and went to answer, unsure who to expect. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Rebecca's father, Charles Sinclair, standing on her porch under a black umbrella. "Mr. Sinclair," Mary said, stunned. The tall man filled her doorway, his demeanor as stiff and formal as ever, but Mary noticed strain in the tight lines around his eyes. "Please come in out of the drizzle." Charles stepped inside, lowering his umbrella. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, despite the casual Saturday morning hour. He murmured a greeting and awkwardly wiped his shoes on the doormat. Mary offered him a seat in the parlor, but he cleared his throat. "I appreciate it, Mrs. Williams, but I won't take much of your time," he said. His voice was measured, the voice of a man used to negotiations. He looked around the modest living room briefly, his gaze flitting over the crochet throw on the sofa, the framed family photos, the small bookshelf crowded with church hymnals and old novels. The homey warmth of Mary's space seemed to make him more rigid, as if he were unsure how to proceed in such surroundings. Mary folded her hands and waited. "How is Rebecca?" she asked after a moment. It was an honest question. Despite everything, Mary's heart still held concern for the girl. Charles pressed his lips together. "She's shaken. Upset." He sighed as if choosing his words carefully. The events of last night were unfortunate. Unfortunate. The word hung between them like a stale odor. Mary nodded slowly. Yes, they were. He removed his gray fedora, a sign perhaps of lowering defenses. "Mrs. Williams, I came here hoping we might find a way to move past this incident. The wedding is so soon, and a lot has been invested in it by both families. Not just financially," he added quickly, "but emotionally as well. Rebecca is my only daughter. I'm sure you understand a father's wish to see his child happy and settled." Mary's mouth felt dry. She did understand that wish. Everything she had done for James came from the same desire. "Of course I do," she replied softly. Charles gave a small nod. "Good, good. Then perhaps we can come to an agreement to ensure that happiness despite the clash last night." Mary's back straightened. "I'm listening," she said. Charles clasped his hands in front of him. He was a picture of composed politeness. "James and Rebecca have had a chance to talk this morning." This was news to Mary. Her eyebrows lifted, but she held her tongue. "They are both upset, as you can imagine. But they do love each other," Charles continued. "Neither of them truly wants to call off the wedding in the cold light of day. Young people are passionate. They say things in the heat of the moment." Mary felt a cautious flicker of relief at the mention that the young couple had spoken. Perhaps, she thought, in calmer tones, they had found a path forward. "I'm glad to hear they're talking," she said sincerely. "I know James cared deeply for Rebecca." Charles offered a tight smile. "Yes, and Rebecca cares for him. She regrets some of her outburst." He cleared his throat again, glancing away for a second. "Youthful tempers aside, we can all agree that respect is paramount, which is why I came here, to ensure that going forward boundaries are clear." Mary's small flame of hope flickered. "Boundaries?" "Don't misunderstand me," Charles said, raising a hand. We appreciate all you've done for James. You've raised a fine man, that's evident in his accomplishments. My future son-in-law is talented and driven. Rebecca has told us about the city development project he spearheaded at work. Securing that new contract for his firm was truly impressive. The kind of achievement that will take him far, especially with the right support and connections. Mary felt a stir of pride for James, mixed with wariness at where Charles was headed. She nodded quietly in acknowledgement of James's work. Charles continued, Rebecca's mother and I want the best for both our children. Last night, tempers flared because expectations weren't aligned. I think he paused, choosing delicacy. I think perhaps Rebecca felt that her wishes for her wedding were not being honored fully. And perhaps you felt similarly on your side, Mr. Sinclair, Mary said, maintaining as courteous a tone as she could. If you have a proposal, I'd like to hear it plainly. Charles breathed in, then gave a curt nod. Very well. The wedding will go on, as planned, but we all need to step back into our appropriate roles. He looked Mary in the eye, his gaze steady but not unkind. For the young folks to succeed in their marriage, they'll need room to make their own decisions, to put each other first. That can be challenging if other family members are too involved. Mary absorbed his words, a slow heat blooming in her chest. And by other family members, you mean me. I mean both sides, of course, Charles said quickly, though the glance he gave around her humble living room suggested otherwise. Evelyn and I intend to give them space too. We'll travel more, visit less in the first year or two, let them breathe, and we'd ask, respectfully, that you do the same. Perhaps take a nice trip, see some relatives out of town, give the newlyweds time to settle without oversight. Mary let silence answer for a moment. She saw now in Charles's carefully neutral expression the reflection of his wife's and daughter's sentiment. They wanted her out, albeit couched in politeness. Mr. Sinclair, she said at length, I have no wish to interfere in James and Rebecca's marriage. I never did. All I ever wanted was to be a supportive presence in my grandson's life, something I hope you can appreciate as a parent yourself. Of course, Charles said, but Mary continued, her voice gaining quiet strength. I understand newlyweds need space. I would never barge in uninvited or try to control their decisions. But if what you're asking is that I remove myself entirely, step back so far that I'm practically not in James's life, then I'm afraid I can't do that. Charles's jaw tightened slightly. No one is suggesting you remove yourself entirely. We're just talking about a healthy distance. For instance, not attending every event or chiming in on decisions unless asked. Trusting that they can figure things out as a couple, Mary folded her arms gently across her waist. I have always tried to let James lead his own life. If I spoke up about the wedding, it was only out of love and concern for him, and usually because I was directly asked for my input. Perhaps I was too present in some of those planning sessions. If so, I can apologize for overstepping. But, she added firmly, I will not be made to feel that loving my grandson and wanting to be part of his life is a crime. Charles raised a placating hand. No one is accusing you of that. We all love James. It's just, this marriage is very important for both our families' futures. Emotions aside, there are social expectations, business ties. Mary held up her own hand now, a mirror to his gesture. She felt a calm resolve wash over her. Let me be blunt then. Your wife and daughter made it clear last night that they consider me an obstacle to those prospects, that my presence in James's life is a hindrance. It sounds as though you're here to deliver that message in gentler terms. Charles stiffened. Mrs. Williams, I assure you... She shook her head, not aggressively, but with sad certainty. Mr. Sinclair, I am a simple woman. I don't have your wealth or influence, but I have my dignity. And I won't barter it away, not even for James's happiness. Because any happiness built on me being cast aside like a nuisance would not be real. Lasting happiness for him either. He frowned, glancing toward the front window where rain drizzled against the glass. What exactly are you saying? Mary took a step forward, her voice quiet and steady. Everything that boy has accomplished, my James, he achieved through his own hard work, through the values of faith and honesty I raised him with, and by the grace of God. Not because of your money or your family status. I have supported him every step of the way, and I'm proud of that. I won't let anyone, no matter how wealthy or powerful, tell me that my role in his life is disposable. Charles looked taken aback by the gentle force in Mary's words. He opened his mouth to respond, but Mary wasn't finished. I am more than willing to bury what happened and treat Rebecca with kindness and respect as my own kin should she become James's wife. I will give them space as is proper, but I will not vanish to make anyone feel more comfortable. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her chin was raised. I will not humiliate myself begging to keep a place in my grandson's heart. That place is mine by right of love and blood, and only James can decide if I hold it or not. Silence filled the cozy living room, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Charles's brows had drawn together. He was not a man used to being spoken to this way, certainly not by someone outside his usual circles. But there was something unassailable in Mary's stance that left him with little to rebuke. After a moment, he inclined his head. I see. I admire your candor, Mrs. Williams. His tone was cooler now, businesslike. Perhaps it's best if we conclude this conversation. I had hoped we might find a compromise, but it appears our positions are rather fixed. Mary's heart pounded in her chest, but she maintained her calm facade. It seems so. Charles put his hat back on and straightened his umbrella. As he moved toward the door, he paused. For what it's worth, James insisted that if the wedding is to go forward, you must be treated with respect. Rebecca has agreed. His voice dropped, an ambiguous note of sincerity creeping in. She truly does care for him. Last night was a shock for everyone. Mary's stern expression softened just a little. She could imagine that behind Charles's polished exterior, he was a father worried about his child's future. I appreciate you telling me that. He nodded once. We still hope to see you at the wedding if it happens? It would be the right thing for appearances. He hesitated, then added almost grudgingly, and perhaps for James' happiness as well. Mary managed a small, sad smile. I will always do what I believe is right for James's happiness. With that, she showed Charles Sinclair out. The drizzle had lightened to a mist, and he departed under his umbrella with a polite farewell. Mary closed the door and leaned against it, closing her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly from the confrontation. She replayed her own words and wondered if she had been too proud, too unyielding. But no, she knew in her soul that every word was true. If they wanted her gone, they would have to face that James's love and success did not depend on their approval. She returned to the kitchen and sank into a chair. The confrontation had left her both drained and oddly at peace. She had spoken her truth. Whatever came next, she would meet it with her head high. That evening, James returned, his eyes red but composed. He listened quietly as Mary recounted Charles Sinclair's visit and what was said. At times, James's jaw clenched in anger, especially hearing how his grandfather-in-law-to-be had essentially suggested Mary absent herself. But when Mary related her response, a faint, proud smile appeared on James's face. I told them I won't humiliate myself or abandon you, not for anything, Mary finished, stirring a pot of stew on the stove. The savory aroma filled the kitchen, but her stomach fluttered too much to feel hunger. James stepped over and gently took the wooden spoon from her hand, guiding her to sit down. Nana, you shouldn't be the one apologizing or defending yourself, he said quietly. I'm sorry they put you in that position. Mary reached up and patted his cheek. He looked so tired. I only told him what you already know, James, that you've made your own way and no one can claim otherwise. Not even me. James knelt by her chair so their eyes were level. You're the reason I am who I am, he said firmly. They seem to think I'd be nothing without their money and connections, but they're wrong. Bitterness crept into his voice. Honestly, after last night, I was ready to walk away and let the Sinclairs handle their gossip fallout themselves. And yet, Mary prompted gently, sensing there was more. He sighed. And yet Rebecca called this afternoon. She was crying. She apologized. Said she was stressed and lost her head. She begged me not to end things. His voice faltered. Mary saw the conflict in his eyes. Love battling with hurt and pride. What did you tell her? Mary asked softly. I told her I'd think about it, he admitted. I needed to see her face to face, I said. So we agreed to meet tomorrow. He ran a hand through his hair. Part of me wanted to tell her it's over right then and there. But another part... He closed his eyes. Another part of me remembered the girl I fell in love with and hoped that maybe, just maybe, last night was an aberration. Mary stroked his shoulder. It's understandable, James. The heart doesn't turn on a dime. If you need to hear her out, to see if things can be mended, that's what you should do. He opened his eyes, searching her face. It wouldn't hurt you? If I tried to work things out with her? Mary's chest ached at the vulnerability in his question. My dear boy, I want you to be happy. If you truly believe she is sorry and willing to change, I will support you. I'll put on my best smile and go to that wedding and bless your union with all my heart. A tear slid down James's face and he lowered his head to rest against Mary's knee. She carted her fingers through his hair as he whispered, Thank you, Nana. I don't deserve you. Hush now, Mary murmured. You deserve every happiness, and don't you worry about me. I'll be fine. They stayed like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. Mary prayed silently for wisdom and for whatever was best to reveal itself in time. The next day, James met Rebecca at a small park where they'd often picnicked during happier times. Mary didn't accompany him. Some things the young couple needed to sort out alone. She did, however, receive a text from James afterward. We talked. She apologized many times, said she'll do anything to fix this. There was an ambivalence in the words, but also a note of cautious hope. Over the following week, preparations for the wedding tentatively resumed, though on a quieter scale. The families agreed to keep the event small and private, citing illness in the family as an excuse to any curious friends asking about drama. Mary noticed that Evelyn and Rebecca kept a conspicuous low profile. There were no more planning meetings at Uncle Henry's, no phone calls. The revised plan was that the ceremony and reception at the country club would proceed, but Mary was not called upon to help or attend any further pre-wedding gatherings. She was, however, formally re-invited to the wedding itself via a politely worded card that arrived in her mailbox as if she were no more than an ordinary guest. Mary had to laugh at that. A sad little laugh. After all that, they sent an invitation to the grandmother of the groom as though nothing had happened. Still, she RSVP'd with a simple "will attend," determined to stand by James on the day no matter her apprehensions. In the quiet of her evenings, Mary busied herself sewing a new dress for the wedding. She chose a dignified dove-gray satin, neutral enough to appease any color schemes, as Evelyn had oh so tactfully suggested, but still elegant in its own right. With each stitch, Mary prayed. Sometimes she prayed for Rebecca, that the girl's heart would soften and grow in understanding. Other times she prayed for strength to endure whatever slights might come at the ceremony. Always she prayed for James that he would not regret his choice, whichever way this unfolded. James visited her often, and their conversations grew lighter as the days passed without incident. There remained an unspoken tension, a knowledge that they were all walking on thin ice, but James reported that Rebecca was being gentle and remorseful in every interaction. She's like the woman I first fell in love with again, he told Mary 2 nights before the wedding, his expression cautiously optimistic. I think she realized what she almost lost. Mary mustered a hopeful smile at that, hiding her lingering doubts. People can change, she reminded herself. Maybe this was a turning point for Rebecca and her mother. On the eve of the wedding, Mary stood in her bedroom looking at herself in the mirror. She smoothed down the front of her gray satin dress and adjusted the lace shawl around her shoulders. Her reflection gazed back, a neatly dressed woman with silver hair tucked under a small feathered hat that matched the shawl. She looked composed, respectable, and older than she felt somehow. For a brief moment she saw herself as Rebecca might see her, an old woman with outdated ways standing in the way of youthful ambition. The thought saddened her. She turned away from the mirror and sat on the edge of her bed. On the nightstand lay her Bible. Mary opened it at random, seeking comfort for her restless spirit. Her eyes fell upon a verse in Proverbs, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." She closed the book with a sigh. Pride had indeed brought them all to the brink of destruction. Rebecca's pride, Evelyn's, perhaps even her own in some measure. Tomorrow would show whose spirit had truly humbled. Mary bowed her head and prayed one more time, for peace at the ceremony, for reconciliation, and if not that, then for truth to shine clear. She prayed that God would set things right, one way or another. When she rose, a fragile resolve had settled in her heart. Whatever happened at that wedding, Mary would walk in with love and integrity. She owed it to James and to herself. Tomorrow would be a day the Lord had made. She would meet it with faith. The day of the wedding arrived, swathed in sunshine, as if nature itself refused to acknowledge the turmoil of the past days. The Sinclair Country Club gleamed with opulence, its manicured lawns and grand ballroom decorated to perfection in ivory and gold. By early afternoon, elegantly dressed guests were milling about the hall, chatting and sipping chilled drinks as a string quartet played softly in the background. Mary entered the venue quietly, alone. She had insisted that James go on ahead with the groomsmen to fulfill his duties, and that she would make her own way. Now, walking into the reception hall, she felt the weight of curious eyes on her. Some of the Sinclair family's high society friends glanced her way with thinly veiled interest, perhaps having heard whispers of the family drama, but too polite to stare outright. Mary smoothed her dove-gray satin dress and held her head high, moving with deliberate grace. If she was to be here, she would endure whatever came with dignity. The ceremony itself was set to take place outside in the club's rose garden, with the reception indoors after. Mary crossed the hall towards the garden terrace. Before she could reach the doors, a familiar voice called out to her, "Mrs. Williams!" "Over here!" Turning, Mary saw Pastor Evans, James's childhood minister, waving from near a cluster of potted palms. Relief washed over her at the sight of a friendly face. Pastor Evans, a stout man in his 70s with a kindly countenance, navigated around clusters of guests to reach her. He wore his formal clerical robes, a white stole draped over them, indicating his role in the ceremony. "Pastor," Mary greeted warmly, reaching out both hands which he clasped in his own, "I'm so happy to see you." "And I you," he replied, concern flickering in his eyes as he studied her. In a lower voice he added, "How are you holding up, Mary?" She mustered a reassuring smile. "I'm all right." "It means a lot that you're officiating today. I know it was important to James." Pastor Evans nodded. It was non-negotiable for him. I'm glad the Sinclairs honored that. He peered at her more closely. "And you, dear? Any trouble so far?" Mary shook her head lightly. "No trouble. Perhaps a few looks, but nothing I can't handle." The pastor patted her hand. "God's grace is with you. Remember, you have many here who care for you and James both." As if to underscore his words, a voice interrupted cheerfully, "Mary Williams, don't you look a vision today?" Mary turned to find Mrs. Green from her church, one of the choir ladies, approaching in a smart hat. She was accompanied by her husband and another elder from the congregation. They greeted Mary with warm hugs. It turned out several members of Mary and James's church community were among the invited guests. James had quietly ensured his side, though smaller, would include people dear to him beyond just blood relations. Their presence bolstered Mary's spirits. In their gentle smiles and casual jokes, she found a slice of normalcy amidst the gilded formality. A chime rang, indicating the ceremony was about to begin. Mary excused herself to take her seat outside. The garden was gorgeous. Rows of white chairs lined an aisle strewn with rose petals. At the front, beneath an arch of lilies and tulle, James stood flanked by his groomsmen. He looked handsome in his fitted charcoal suit, but Mary noticed the tension in his stance, the way his eyes kept scanning the seating area as guests settled, searching until they found her. She gave him a small, encouraging nod as she took her place in the front row on the groom's side. Evelyn Sinclair, radiant in a champagne-colored gown, sat on the opposite side with Charles and their close relatives. If not for the slight tightening of her jaw, one would think her perfectly composed. She did not acknowledge Mary with more than a flick of her eyes. A hush fell as the string quartet launched into Pachelbel's canon. All heads turned as Rebecca emerged at the end of the aisle, aglow in a lace bridal gown and veil. She was undeniably beautiful. Even Mary felt a pang at the sight. Rebecca's face was partially concealed by the veil, but as she walked toward James on her father's arm, Mary could discern a tremble in her step. Was it nerves, or the lingering shadows of the week's events? The ceremony began. Pastor Evans led them through the prayers and readings with practiced ease. Mary bowed her head and focused on her breathing, steadying her racing heart. When the time came for the vows, James's voice rang out, clear and steady, reciting the words he had likely practiced. Rebecca's voice was softer, and it wavered enough that a few guests smiled sympathetically, assuming emotion. "Speak now or forever hold your peace," intoned the pastor with a light smile, an almost rhetorical line these days. No one expected an objection, and none came, though Mary saw a few eyes dart momentarily in her direction, as if in mischievous wonder. She kept her gaze calmly forward. Just as the couple exchanged rings, a subtle commotion arose at the back of the assembly. Mary glimpsed a late-arriving group of 4 or 5 people being seated by a flustered usher. They were well-dressed, distinguished-looking individuals whom she recognized with a jolt of surprise. One was none other than Brother Thompson, a deacon from their church, who was also a prominent figure on the city council. Beside him sat his wife, and next to them, Mary's heart nearly skipped, was Mr. Randall, James's division manager at his company, accompanied by an aide. These were people of import, both in the church and the town's business circles. Mary had no idea they had been invited, let alone that they would attend. She noticed Evelyn and Charles exchange curious, slightly perturbed glances at the last-minute guests. Rebecca and James at the altar seemed oblivious, fully absorbed in the gravity of the moment. Finally, Pastor Evans smiled and announced, "By the power vested in me by God and the state of Georgia, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." Polite applause rippled through the gathering as James lifted Rebecca's veil and gave her a tender, if somewhat solemn, kiss. Mary clapped along with everyone, tears moistening her eyes, not all of sorrow nor all of joy, but a bittersweet mix. It was done. They were married. Mary prayed this truly would be a fresh start. The newlyweds led the procession back up the aisle as the quartet played a cheerful recessional. They looked every bit the perfect couple, smiling for photographers and friends. But James managed to steal one brief, meaningful glance toward Mary and the crowd, a look that said thank you and stay close. She offered him a reassuring smile. As guests flowed back into the ballroom for the reception, Mary found herself momentarily alone at the edge of the crowd. She stepped aside, letting others pass as she collected her emotions. It had been a beautiful ceremony on the surface. Only those intimately involved knew of the fragility beneath the smiles. "Mrs. Williams, congratulations!" exclaimed a voice as Brother Thompson approached, hand outstretched. "What a fine ceremony!" Mary shook the deacon's hand warmly. "Thank you, Brother Thompson." "I'm so pleased you and your wife could make it. We wouldn't miss it," his wife interjected kindly. "James is such a bright young man. Your whole church family is proud today, Mr. Randall, James's manager, also came up, nodding in agreement. "I had to be here to support my best analyst," he said with a grin, though I admit I was surprised to get an invitation from the Sinclairs. I didn't realize they were keen to mix with us city project folks, but I figured they'd want representation from the development team after James's success. Mary's eyes widened slightly. "Invitation from the Sinclairs?" she echoed. Mr. Randall shrugged. "It came via the company." Perhaps James arranged it quietly. Either way, I'm glad to be here. He lowered his voice. And I certainly wanted to meet the grandmother he speaks so highly of. Mary felt warmth rise to her cheeks. You're too kind. James's achievements are all his own. We're just very grateful for the opportunities he's had. The manager smiled. Well, he earned them. That idea he presented about the urban youth center redevelopment was a game changer. It won our firm that multi-million-dollar city contract. To think, he said it was inspired by something you told him about the old jazz hall in your neighborhood. Mr. Randall chuckled. Brilliant and community-minded. He's going places, Mrs. Williams. Before Mary could respond, an elegant older woman in a brimmed hat joined the little circle. Mrs. Ellsworth, a matriarch from Mary's church, who also happened to be on the board of a local charity. She greeted Mary enthusiastically, then turned to introduce herself to Mr. Randall and Brother Thompson, who were prominent in the community like herself. Within minutes, Mary found herself at the center of a congenial gathering of some of the city's and church's respected figures, all chatting amiably. They weren't here for the Sinclairs' champagne or prestige. They were here out of genuine respect for James and, by extension, Mary. Across the ballroom, Evelyn Sinclair watched this cluster with growing unease. She had been circulating among the high society guests, playing the gracious hostess, when she noticed that a number of people of note, people she only vaguely knew from philanthropy events or council meetings, were paying court not to her or Rebecca, but to the groom's grandmother. It wasn't long before one of Evelyn's friends murmured to her, I didn't know you were so well connected with the mayor's council, Evie. Getting Thompson here was a feat, Evelyn blinked. Mayor's council? Oh, yes. Well, James is quite involved in community projects, she managed, trying to disguise her surprise. Meanwhile, Mary was oblivious to the ripple her little gathering was causing. She laughed gently as Mrs. Ellsworth recounted a charming anecdote about James tutoring kids at the church's after-school program. Brother Thompson chimed in with praise for James's dedication to that new youth center plan. Mr. Randall added an anecdote about how James had spearheaded volunteer cleanups at the project site on weekends. All of this praise drifted lightly through the air, and nearby guests began to catch bits of it. Some of Rebecca's friends exchanged surprised looks. This wasn't the narrative they'd heard, where the Sinclairs were the benefactors and James the lucky beneficiary. Whispers started percolating. James did that? I heard he got that contract for his firm. Isn't that the project the Sinclairs were talking about? At the head table, Rebecca sat stiffly beside James, acknowledging well-wishers who came by. She noticed his attention had strayed across the room. Following his gaze, she saw Mary surrounded by an unusual mix of their guests, people Rebecca barely knew. James's expression was one of quiet pride, and something in Rebecca's gut twisted. This was not how she envisioned her reception, her groom and his grandmother as the inadvertent stars. Desperate to regain control of the narrative, Rebecca rose, pulling James with her. They approached the knot of people around Mary just as Mr. Randall was saying, there was some credit to James and, of course, to his upbringing. The values and work ethic you instilled in him, Mrs. Williams, are a treasure. Indeed, Brother Thompson boomed kindly. He raised his glass. I'd like to propose a toast. Excuse me, Rebecca interjected, sliding into the circle with James at her arm. Her smile was tight but wide, the kind of social smile that didn't reach her eyes. I hope everyone's enjoying the reception. We're so honored by your presence. The little group offered polite smiles in return. Mr. Randall nodded to the bride. It's a lovely event, Mrs. Sinclair. Rebecca. Thank you for including us. He gestured with genuine admiration toward Mary. We were just commending James's grandmother here on raising such a fine young man. You're a fortunate woman to be joining this family. Rebecca's jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. Evelyn had sidled over as well, catching the tail end of the remark. Yes, very fortunate, Rebecca managed, placing a possessive hand on James's arm. James's family is certainly salt of the earth. Mary could detect the strain in Rebecca's tone. She felt a wave of pity for the girl. This was supposed to be her shining moment, yet here she was forced to confront the reality that James's life and achievements did not revolve around her family's influence at all. Evelyn cleared her throat and stepped forward with a polished laugh. "We're all so proud of James," she said, gliding into the conversational gap. "He and Rebecca make quite the team. I'm sure together they'll do wonderful things with the support of both our families." It was a deft attempt to recenter the spotlight, but Brother Thompson, a straightforward man, chuckled. "From what I hear, James already had a remarkable support system long before today. Mary here is something of a legend in our church community." "Oh, absolutely," Mrs. Ellsworth agreed. She smiled benignly at Rebecca and Evelyn. "Why, the way Mary took on raising James and poured her love and faith into him, well, it's an inspiration. Not every young man would grow up to be so grounded with all his success, but James has, a credit to his upbringing as Mr. Randall said. Rebecca's smile grew noticeably brittle. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her clutch. In the silence that followed, the subtext was clear to all. Mary, not the Sinclairs, was the foundation beneath James's accomplishments. James, sensing the growing tension, gently spoke up. "Thank you, all of you, for your kind words," he said, his voice humble but proud. He slipped an arm around Rebecca's waist, trying to include her. "I'm grateful to both my families today, those I was born with and those I've gained. It means everything to have all of you here." The sincerity in his tone eased the awkwardness slightly. The community guests smiled and nodded, beginning to disperse with polite excuses to refresh their drinks or greet others. Soon only Mary, James, Rebecca, and Evelyn remained in their corner, an island of private conflict amid the festive sea. Evelyn was the first to break the fragile silence. She fixed James with a tight smile. "Such esteemed guests, James. I must say I wasn't expecting the city council here." James gave a mild shrug. "I thought it would be good for them to see the project's champion getting married," he said simply, though Mary caught a flicker of challenge in his eyes. Rebecca's cheeks flared. "You invited them and didn't tell us?" she hissed under her breath, trying to maintain a neutral expression for anyone watching. "They're my guests from my side," James replied quietly. There was a firmness to his voice that warned against rebuke. Rebecca opened her mouth, but Evelyn subtly touched her arm, a signal to hold her tongue. Instead, Evelyn turned to Mary with a stretched smile. "Mary, dear," she said softly, "you must be so pleased to see how respected James is." "We all are." Mary saw the desperation behind the other woman's eyes and appealed to bury the hatchet, at least publicly. For James's sake, Mary mustered a gracious nod. "I am very pleased," she replied. "I'm sure we all want what's best for him." "Of course," Evelyn said. She started to say more, but just then a waiter approached with a tray of champagne flutes, offering them for the upcoming toasts. Evelyn took two, handing one to Rebecca. James declined, as did Mary. At the clinking of a fork on glass, everyone moved to take their seats for the formal toasts. Charles Sinclair stood at the microphone, giving the typical father of the bride speech that blended humor and heartfelt wishes. He made a cordial mention of James's humble roots and bright future. Mary noticed he carefully framed it as a joint future with the support of both families together. Following Charles, the best man spoke, sharing funny anecdotes of college days. Then it was time for the groom to say a few words. James took the microphone, his tall figure visibly steeling itself. Mary watched him intently, as did Rebecca, who sat with a fixed smile. James started by thanking everyone for coming. He thanked the Sinclairs for organizing such a beautiful event and his own family, his eyes finding Mary, for always being there to guide and ground him. There was applause at that, and Mary felt herself flush with pride. As he spoke, however, a current of emotion underlined his words. His thanks to the Sinclairs was courteous, but lacked warmth. When he spoke of values and upbringing, his voice gained strength. "I owe who I am today to one person above all," James said, his voice resonating in the hushed hall. "My grandmother, Mary." He gestured toward her, and suddenly a spotlight of attention swung Mary's way. She instinctively shook her head modestly as a few tables clapped and murmured approval. She sacrificed so much to raise me, James continued, and she taught me to stand for what I believe in. To stand for the people I love. Mary's heart hammered. Something in his tone told her this was more than a thank you, it was a declaration. James turned slightly, so he was addressing not just the guests, but specifically the head table, Rebecca and the Sinclairs beside her. In recent days, he said, voice clear, I've been tested on those lessons. I've learned that marriage is not just a union of two people, but of two families and two sets of values. And I've realized, he drew a breath, that not all values align. A ripple of whispers spread. Rebecca's smile faltered. James? She breathed, barely audible. He looked at his bride, love and sorrow mingling in his expression. Rebecca, he said gently, yet his words carried, you know I love you. But I cannot, will not betray the woman who raised me or compromise the values she instilled in me. Not for anything. Oh, hush fell so complete that the faint hum of the air conditioner could be heard. James set down the microphone on the stand. It caught the faint, trembling catch in his breath. He reached over and took Mary's hand, urging her to stand with him. Mary did so, her legs almost buckling with sudden adrenaline. A collective gasp went through the crowd as pieces clicked into place, the gossip, the tension, now this drama before their eyes. I'm sorry, James spoke, now directly to Rebecca and her parents, though everyone could hear. But I cannot go on as if respect and love weren't violated this week. I won't pretend that everything is all right, not even here, not even today. Rebecca shot to her feet, face blanching. James, what are you doing? We're married. It isn't too late for honesty, James interrupted softly. Pain etched lines around his eyes. Rebecca, last night I prayed for guidance. I hoped my love for you would be enough to overcome the differences between us. But seeing everyone here today, seeing how many people respect my grandmother, how much she means to me and to others, I know I can't start a life by pushing aside the person who gave me life. His voice grew firmer, even as it shook. You asked me to choose, Rebecca, and I choose her. I choose my family and the values that made me who I am. A stunned silence. Then a sudden babble of exclamations and murmurs erupted among the guests. Some half rose from their seats in confusion. Cameras flashed uncertainly. Rebecca swayed as if struck. Evelyn leapt up to steady her daughter. This is absurd, Evelyn snapped, eyes blazing at James and Mary. Have you lost your mind? Think of what you're doing to Rebecca, to all of us. Charles also stood, arms raised as though to calm a riot. Now, son, let's step aside and talk this through privately. No, Dad, Rebecca choked, finding her voice at last. She tore away from her mother's grasp, fury igniting in her eyes, humiliation flush on her cheeks. He wants to humiliate us, evidently. Why not let him say it plainly? Her voice climbed in pitch. Go on, James. Announce to everyone what a terrible wife I am, what awful people we are. Isn't that what you want? James looked stricken. That's not what I... Rebecca stepped around the table toward him, fists clenched at her sides. The perfect bride mask was shattered. In its place, raw hurt and anger contorted her lovely face. You made vows to me, she spat, before God. Now you throw them away in front of everyone for her? She jabbed a finger toward Mary. Mary felt Clarisse and Henry appear at her shoulders as if to protect her from the vitriol. But Mary gently stepped forward. Her heart ached for the young woman in front of her, despite everything. Rebecca, Mary said softly, her voice somehow carrying through the shocked quiet. She wanted to tell her that no one wanted this to happen, that this was a tragedy for all. But before she could continue, Rebecca rounded on her. No, I will not hear any more from you, Rebecca's voice cracked. You've hated me from the start. You poisoned James against me. Tears glistened in her eyes now, threatening to spill her mascara. Mary shook her head, tears of her own slipping free. Child, that isn't true. I never... Enough! It was Evelyn, her voice cold as ice. She drew herself up beside her daughter, glaring at Mary and James as if they were lowly subordinates. "You two deserve each other," she bit out. "We welcomed you into our lives, into our family, and you repay us with this spectacle? How dare you?" She pointed at James, her voice trembling with rage and embarrassment. "You think you can just walk away?" "There will be consequences for this, James Williams, I assure you, for both of you." Her furious gaze flickered to Mary. Brother Thompson and a few other upstanding guests had come closer, perhaps intending to intervene, but the Sinclairs' open threat halted them in surprise. James released Mary's hand and stepped forward, placing himself between his grandmother and the Sinclairs. "Are you threatening us, Mrs. Sinclair?" he asked almost sadly. Charles put a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, trying to pull her back. "Evelyn, stop! This isn't the time—" She shrugged him off. "They humiliated us in public, Charles. In front of everyone we know. Do you expect me to just smile and eat cake now?" The crowd that had gathered to watch, nearly all the guests by this point, stood in awkward, breathless silence. It was a scene none of them would ever forget. The bride and her mother in an open showdown with the groom and his grandmother mere minutes after exchanging vows. Rebecca let out a sob of pure frustration. "I gave up everything for you, James," she cried, her voice ringing. "I loved you. But I will not live like this, always second to her." She nearly spat the word. James's face was ashen, tears visible in his eyes. Yet he spoke with a calm that belied the storm around him. "No one should be second to anyone in a marriage, Rebecca. That was the point. I'm sorry, but this is for the best." "For whom? For you two?" Rebecca snapped, wiping furiously at her tears. She turned a wild, grief-stricken look toward the crowd as if searching for support. Some of her friends and relatives rushed forward to console her, shooting reproachful looks at James and Mary. At this, a new voice rose from the audience, clear and commanding in tone. It was Brother Thompson. "I think enough has been said here," he declared, stepping into the fray with an authority born of years of public service. "This is a family matter, painful as it is, and perhaps we should give them some privacy." His words gently broke the feverish spell. A few of the more decorous guests murmured agreement. One by one, people began to disperse, giving space or quietly heading for the exits in shock. The string quartet, unsure what to do, had long since gone silent. Rebecca stood trembling, surrounded now by her bridesmaids and her mother's protective arm. She glared at James through her tears. "I hate you for this," she whispered, voice raw and low. James absorbed the blow, nodding faintly as if he felt he deserved it. Then he turned to Mary. She opened her arms and he went into them, burying his face in her shoulder like a broken man. Mary held him tightly, her own tears wetting his hair as she closed her eyes against the sight of the Sinclairs, the guests, all of it. In that embrace, time seemed to pause. Mary stroked her grandson's back and whispered words meant only for him. "It's all right, baby. God is here with us. We'll be okay." She kissed his temple, rocking him as she had done decades ago when life's injustices were scraped knees and lost toys. Evelyn guided a sobbing Rebecca away, Charles flanking them, his face a mix of anger and pity. As they departed, Evelyn threw one last venomous glance over her shoulder, but Mary barely noticed. All her focus was on James, on comforting her child in the ruins of this day. Only a handful of people remained around them now. Pastor Evans, Brother Thompson, Uncle Henry, Clarice, and a few close church friends. These good souls formed a loose circle, shielding Mary and James from prying eyes while offering quiet support. Pastor Evans rested a hand on James's shoulder. "Son," he said softly, "let's get you somewhere quiet." James lifted his head from Mary's shoulder. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he nodded. Keeping an arm around Mary, he allowed himself to be led gently out of the hall, away from the whispers and stares. Uncle Henry fetched Mary's shawl and draped it over her shoulders protectively. As they made their way toward a side exit, Mary looked up and saw Mr. Randall and Mrs. Ellsworth nearby, sadness and respect in their faces. Others who cared for them offered small nods or squeezed Mary's hand as she passed. It struck her profoundly that even in this moment of public disgrace, she and James were not alone. They were walking out not in shame, but with heads held high, surrounded by those who truly mattered. Before they stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, Mary paused and turned back for just a moment. The reception room was half empty now, strewn with remnants of a celebration that would not be. Leftover champagne flutes, uneaten cake on plates, golden decorations shimmering meaninglessly. It could have felt like a scene of defeat. Yet Mary's heart, while heavy, felt an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. The worst had come to pass, and still she stood, arm in arm with her grandson, both of them intact in spirit. She looked at James, who managed a faint, brave smile for her through his tears. Mary reached up and smoothed his hair gently, the gesture full of unconditional love. "God always puts things right in the end," she whispered to him. Her voice was steady, imbued with the certainty of faith tested and affirmed. James pressed his forehead to hers for a brief moment, eyes closed, absorbing those words. Together, supported by their family and friends, Mary and James stepped out of the gilded hall into open air, leaving behind the echoes of a broken promise and carrying with them the unbroken bond that had seen them through every storm. The summer days that followed the ill-fated wedding were surprisingly peaceful for Mary and James. In the wake of such public turmoil, one might have expected chaos or scandal, but what settled over their lives was a quiet, healing calm. Within their Atlanta neighborhood, the old quarter where walls remembered jazz and Sunday sermons, word of what happened at the country club spread swiftly. Neighbors spoke in hushed, astonished tones of how the wedding had ended. Some details grew exaggerated in retelling, but the heart of the story remained the same. A grandson who would not forsake his grandmother, a woman who stood her ground with grace, and a wealthy family's pride brought low. People Mary barely knew stopped her on her morning walks to the market. "Mrs. Williams," said Mrs. Patel from 2 doors down one day, pressing a hand to her heart. "I heard about what happened. You're an example to us all. You know that? The way you carried yourself. The way James stood up for you. We're all mighty proud to have you in the community." Mary thanked her kindly, demurring that she'd done nothing special, but inside she felt a glow of validation and relief. At Greater Hope Baptist Church the following Sunday, Pastor Evans, discreetly sidestepping explicit mention of the wedding, preached about Daniel in the lion's den and the reward of steadfast faith. Many in the congregation, aware of Mary's ordeal, drew the parallels and nodded. After service, congregants young and old came to give Mary gentle hugs or words of support. Sister Green from the choir told her, "Child, we were praying for you and James." God answered, "Even if not in the way we expected," Mary simply replied, "He sure did put things in order," which earned knowing smiles. James had taken a short leave from work, but Mr. Randall visited him personally to convey the company's support, and the news that his project's success had only grown in esteem after the story got around. "Clients heard how you stood up for your values," Mr. Randall confided over a coffee at Mary's kitchen table, "and they said they know now they picked the right man to trust with community projects." James flushed modestly at that, but Mary beamed. It seemed even in the business world, integrity carried its own quiet power. As for the Sinclairs, they kept their distance. Apart from a formal notice that an annulment was being processed, for which James readily signed the papers, there was no direct contact. A few society column whispers alluded to a private falling out that ended the alliance between the Williams and Sinclair families, but the scandal was largely confined to upper-crust gossip circles. Evelyn and Charles, Mary heard, left town for an extended vacation soon after, likely to let the rumors die down. Rebecca stayed out of sight. Mary often found herself praying for the girl, praying that with time Rebecca's wounded heart would heal and perhaps soften into wisdom. One warm evening a month after the wedding that wasn't, Mary and James sat on their front porch swing sipping iced tea. The crickets were serenading and fireflies winked across the yard. James had his arm around his grandmother's shoulder, a gentle protectiveness that had only deepened since that day. They talked in low tones about everyday things, the progress on the youth center, a new recipe Mary wanted to try, a co-worker of James who'd asked him to join a pickup basketball league. There was laughter again in James's voice, a lightness Mary cherished. He still carried hurt. She could see it in his eyes sometimes, a lingering sorrow when something reminded him of Rebecca. But little by little, that hurt was giving way to hope. He spoke of possibly taking night classes for an advanced degree, of dreams he had for expanding the community project model to other neighborhoods. Mary listened, interjecting encouragement now and then, letting him imagine a future unbridled by the drama of recent weeks. At a pause in the conversation, James turned to Mary, his expression earnest in the golden porch light. "Nana," he said softly, "are you truly happy with how things turned out? I know it was ugly. I know it's not what either of us wanted going in." Mary looked at her grandson, the integrity in his face, the kindness, and smiled gently. "I won't say I wanted it to happen that way," she answered. "It broke my heart to see you hurt. But am I happy? You stayed true to yourself and to what's right." "Oh, absolutely." She reached over and patted his hand. "We faced the lions, you and me, and by God's mercy we walked out without losing ourselves. That's something to be thankful for," James nodded, squeezing her hand. "I am thankful. For you most of all," he hesitated, then added quietly, "You know, some people at work ask me about it, almost like they expected me to be bitter or regret speaking up. I told them I regret nothing where my Nana is concerned." He chuckled softly. "A couple of them even said they wish they'd had a grandmother like you growing up." Mary felt tears prick her eyes, but they were warm, glad tears. "Oh, now," she fussed lightly, "I'm sure their grandmas were just fine." Then she laughed, the sound twining with the night breeze. "But I'll happily be everyone's honorary grandma if it means I get to share a bit of what God's taught me in life." They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the rustle of leaves. Eventually, James spoke again, something that had clearly been on his mind. "Nana, the story of what happened, it's kind of become, well, almost like a lesson folks talk about, hasn't it?" Mary tilted her head. "How do you mean?" He gave a slight shrug. "I've heard things, like at church or from neighbors. They say it reminds them that money and status aren't everything, that honesty and faith count more in the end." He looked down at his hands, then back up. "It's strange being at the center of a moral of the story, Ma, but if our troubles opened some eyes, maybe it wasn't for nothing." A smile spread slowly across Mary's face. "James, I believe very little in life is for nothing. God uses even the hard times to teach and to shine light." She gazed out at the street where an older couple walked a dog and waved at them. Mary waved back, her wedding band catching the light. How long had it been since her own sweet husband passed? Yet here she was, life carrying onward, new chapters still unfolding. The tale of what had happened with Rebecca would become just one among many in the tapestry of their lives, albeit a particularly luminous thread, highlighting the strength of their bond. Mary thought of the phrase she'd repeated to herself so often lately: "God always sets things right." Not in the way of fairy tales, or even in the way one might pray for, but in God's own time and wisdom. Truth had prevailed over deception, dignity over shame, love over greed. Turning to James, Mary reached up and gently tapped the golden cross pendant he wore, one she had given him when he graduated college. "Remember this, child?" she asked. He nodded. "Of course. You told me to keep faith close to my heart always." Mary's eyes twinkled. "That advice has seen me through many a storm, and it saw us through this one." James leaned over and kissed her cheek. "I love you, Nana," he said softly. "I love you too, my James," Mary replied, her voice full of contentment. As dusk settled in, they stayed on that porch swing a while longer, watching the world turn gently around them. The story of Mary Williams and her grandson's fateful wedding day passed into local legend, a reminder whispered over fences and shared between friends. People would say that dignity and faith had proven stronger than pride and lies, that sometimes the richest person in the room was the one with nothing but integrity to their name. And Mary? She lived the rest of her days humbly in the old Atlanta quarter, cherished by her family and community. In quiet moments, she often reflected on how the Lord had indeed put everything in its rightful place. Through trial and tears, he had affirmed what she knew in her soul. Stand firm in truth and love, and you will emerge from any storm with your spirit intact. In the end, Mary found peace in that knowledge. Whatever else life held in store, she faced it with the steady assurance that had carried her through this chapter and would carry her through all the ones to come. God had set things right, and all was well.